Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and we just got done playing what might be the shortest game session ever. It was Rogue of the X-Men, played by my wife, squaring off against the brother of the Skrull Loki, who we talked about in great detail in the last adventure. So rather than me explaining all of that again in this adventure, just make sure you check out that video first, the last video that I uploaded before this one. Otherwise, this one might not make much sense. So, all that said, the prologue to today's story is a brief recap of a few recent relevant adventures. In our game world, just like in the Marvel Universe itself, some of the alien Skrulls have heroic motivations, while other members of their species are villains. In the Earth K dimension, the current Skrull Empress is actually very good. And as such, those Skrulls that she rules over who are evil hate her and have formed a rebellion against her empire. One of those rebels used a pirated version of the Super Skrull technology so that he could have the powers of Loki. He was destroyed by Doctor Doom in a previous game session. Doctor Doom also went to the Skrull homeworld and used that same technology to make a replica of the Infinity Gauntlet. And because the Infinity Gems are so powerful, this process destroyed the machinery that the rebels had been using to give them powers and to create these artifacts. So the evil Skrulls were furious with Doctor Doom, especially the brother of Skrull Loki, who vowed revenge. He managed to get his hands on the Skrull version of the Infinity Gauntlet that Doom made, but the gems needed to be charged with energy before he could use them. So in our last game session, he abducted the grandson of Reed Richards to make this happen. And that brings us to today's game session, which we just got done playing. My wife played Rogue as the hero for this game. And Rogue, for those who don't know, was involved in this summer's big crisis event that celebrated the 40th anniversary of our campaign. And during that game, Rogue encountered a version of the Legion of Superheroes who were from one of many possible futures. In specific, Rogue encountered a Legionnaire named Power Boy, aka Jedediah Rycane, whose stats can be found in the first edition Legion of Superheroes sourcebook on page 76. And Power Boy's big claim to fame is that he has a strength of 184, which is just insane. To the best of my knowledge, he has more strength than any other character in the DC Heroes role playing game. By the way, if there are any DC Heroes fans listening to this, if you guys know of any official stats for someone stronger than that, let me know. I would be really curious to hear about that. Anyway, so Rogue absorbed Power Boy's powers and his purple skin color. Rogue also encountered a different Legion, but these guys were not from the future. They were from the modern day. I'll take a quick second to explain who they are because if you are not a fan of DC Comics, you've probably never heard of this team. And also, if you're a fan of recent DC Comics, you still maybe haven't heard of this team. The basic idea that you need to know is that the first Brainiac, the classic Superman villain called Brainiac, was sort of like a Terminator. He was a robot, but then over top of that, he had this fake skin, right? And he was disguised as a native of the planet Kolu. And while he resided there to keep up appearances, to try to pass himself off as a Cthulhuan, he adopted a child who he named Brainiac 2. That kid eventually grew up and had a son of his own named Brainiac 3, who also grew up and would be the father then of a girl named Brainiac 4. And then she is destined to one day have a son named Brainiac 5, who 1,000 years from now is a prominent member of the Legion of Superheroes. But Brainiac 5's great grandfather, Brainiac 2, founded a modern day team of anti heroes called Legion. And in the case of that team, the word Legion is an acronym which stands for Licensed Extra Governmental Interstellar Operatives Network. And then there was also an opposing team called Rebels, and that was also an acronym. And that stood for Revolutionary Elite Brigade to eradicate Legion supremacy. I would talk about how neither Legion nor Rebels were really very heroic in the moral sense, but that's beyond the scope of today's video. The point is that on Earth K in 2025, the team called Rebels are bad guys, and Brainiac 3 was leading them. So Rogue absorbed the attributes and powers of Brainiac 3, specifically something that DC Comics refers to as a 12th level intellect, which in first edition DC Heroes is represented with an intelligence of 25 APs. Also, in a previous adventure, the Kara Zor-El from the antimatter universe of Quard had defected to Earth K, where she was cloned. And Rogue had also absorbed the powers of one of those clones. So when this game session began, Rogue had a dexterity of 26, an intelligence of 25, and an influence of 10, as well as 24 APs of super speed. And in DC Heroes, you add all of those numbers up, and then that is how you calculate your basic initiative, right? So then my wife rolled an 8 on 1d10, and then you add that to everything else. And the point is that Rogue got to go first, right? She went before the Skrull did. And when the game begins, Rogue is out in space using the sealed systems and flight powers that she got from Ultra Girl's clone. She is returning from that situation between the Legion and the Rebels, where those two groups have been fighting, and she had absorbed the powers of Brainiac 3 when she encounters the brother of Skrull Loki. When last we saw him, he had kidnapped Reed Richards II and forced him to charge the Infinity Gems that were made using the Super Skrull technology. And he has used the power of the Skrull Gauntlet to transfer all of that power from the newly charged gems into himself. But amazingly enough, even though he now has 40 APs of Omnipower, Omnipower isn't actually used to calculate initiative. On your turn, you can sub Omnipower for super speed, and then it will affect your initiative. But for that to happen, you first need it to be your turn. So without that factored in, Skrull Loki's brother only had a dex of 16, an intelligence of 8, and an influence of 20. So Rogue is faster, and on her turn, she spends an automatic action getting to where her opponent was. Then she used her super speed. And in DC Heroes, you can use super speed to reduce the amount of time it takes you to complete a task. So let's say it would normally take you 10 APs of time to do your homework, and you have 7 APs of super speed. You subtract 7 from 10 and you get 3. So that means the character with super speed could do their homework in just 3 APs a time, which is a much, much smaller amount of time, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Again, if anything I say doesn't make sense, just drop me a line in the comments section and I'll try to do a better job of explaining things. Anyway, so Rogue uses super speed to reduce the amount of time it would take to drain all of the Skrull's powers. Then she does permanently. On his turn, then he attacks her, but without his powers, he's unable to hurt her. And on her next turn, she just knocks him out. So the fact that it went down as fast as that reminded me of kind of like when you're watching a movie about the Old West and two cowboys, meet on the street at high noon and it's all about who's faster. To me, that's how this went down, you know, because if he got to go, he would have messed her up really, really bad. All he needed was to go first. He had just a ton of power, but he was too slow. And that brings us to the epilogue. Rogue has all sorts of powers now. And by using them, she is able to locate Reed Richards II. She goes to him and then she takes him back to Earth. Reed is returned to Four Freedoms Plaza, where he offers to use his lab to see how she's doing, basically. It's almost like a physical, right? That there's a little bit of concern about all of this power she just absorbed, even if it was the real Infinity Gauntlet, there would be some concern associated with that. The fact it's this weird, pirated Skrull technology that seems like it might be unreliable, there's kind of a lot of variables there, right? So they give her a thorough going over, right? And that was it. That was that game session. Like I said, it's pretty short. It was anticlimactic, but my wife had fun. And there are a couple of things that I think are worth talking about. First of all, when I owned the local comic book store about 25 years ago, Chris Claremont had returned to the X-Men books. I want to say his first issue back was X-Men Volume 2, issue number 100, but I could be wrong. Anyways, he had been away for a while, and around the year 2000, he returned to the book, and he was doing a lot of interviews at the time. And in one of them, fans asked Chris Claremont what his plans were. And he said he had huge plans for Rogue. According to him, his intention had always been for Rogue to become the quote unquote most powerful being in the Marvel universe. But he wanted to start her off first with like a really humble origin story. And then over the years, he wanted to have her work her way up, right? And he was frustrated because he thought that every writer after him kept her at the same level, that she was never evolving or progressing as a character. So when he returned to the book, one of the first things he did was he had Rogue minding her own business one day when all of a sudden she pops claws like Wolverine and has a body of metal like Colossus and an optic blast like Cyclops, so on and so forth. And Claremont's idea here was that Rogue no longer would have to touch a mutant now to get their powers. Just being around them from a distance would give her access to their powers. And not only that, her body could remember every mutant she has ever been in the same room with, whether she touched them or not. And once she got a handle on that, then she'd be able to use all of their powers all at once, whenever she wants, whether they're around or not. So, what happened in this game session, in my humble opinion, was very much in line with the original vision that Chris Claremont had for Rogue, that she'd one day be this massive cosmic being, but that her humble origins would keep it from going to her head. And to the best of my knowledge, my wife didn't know anything about this, right? So I thought it was really interesting that when the game was over, she said that she thought it would be cool if Rogue was sort of like a Tom Bombadil figure. For those that don't know, Tom Bombadil is one of the weirdest characters from the original Lord of the Rings books. He is this ageless being of immense power who can command nature with a song and is completely immune to the One Ring. Yet, despite this, he remains detached from the struggles of good and evil, and he's content to live in his own little corner of the world, hands off, from the affairs of Middle Earth. And I mentioned this because my wife's pitch is for Rogue to return to Mississippi and build like a really big, really nice farmhouse with a wraparound deck and spend the rest of her days watching over her children and, their children, Rogue's many grandchildren, just drinking sweet tea and like watching the sunset. And I thought that was really kind of cool, and I totally get why she would associate that with the Tom Bombadil character. And I also could see how that would be the ultimate story arc for Rogue, that she starts off and she can't touch people and so on and so forth. And because of all these powers she has, she'd have force fields and stuff like that now. She could totally um touch people and not have to worry about stuff like before. And you know what I mean? Um, so on my end, when it comes to worrying about things like game balance and whether I want her new powers to be permanent or to fade with time, her plans make it seem all right to me to just let her keep the powers. And my wife is really into the idea of having Rogue as this cosmic being. And for those who know about my wife's medical conditions that I've talked about on the channel before, she has constant strokes. She's in a wheelchair now, she didn't used to be, she's got all this other stuff going wrong in her life. I figure it wouldn't hurt anything to let her have this cosmic version of Rogue in her RPG binder with all of her other character sheets. If that's what makes her happy, then I am giving her the win on this one. You know what I mean? Anyways, but that was it. That was this game session. It was unorthodox, but hopefully you still enjoyed hearing about the game as well as some of the thought process, associated with this one. If so, as always, we would be ever so grateful if you'd be willing to take a quick moment to smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from all of us here, associated with the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next one.